Hey guys, my name is Nick and welcome back to the channel and welcome to the first in a brand new series of videos that we're going to be talking about my one true love, Beyond Tzeentch, Thousand Suns, Imperial Fists and everything else that I've got. The one true love, the mighty, mighty Imperial Knights. For those of you who've been around the channel for a while, you know that I've got a bit of a Forge World fetish. I do like big knights, big Warlord Titans and all that good stuff. But we're going to be talking specifically about the non-Warlord class. We're talking Titanic, but we're talking Imperial Knights. So we're going to take a look through the Codex. There's a number of things wrong with the Codex that's been addressed with all kinds of things in FAQs, chapter approved and so on. We'll get to each of those sections as we go through the Codex. But we're talking pure knights here, no soup, no single knight allied to Imperial Guard or anything like that. This is all about making an Imperial Knight army. But we're going to go through each of the different sections in order to do that. So there's a number of things that I want to cover in this opening video, and then subsequent series videos will break down each of the different classes of knights and eventually try and come up with some various different army options available to you. So in this video we're going to be covering the main parts out of the rulebook. So the first thing we're going to be covering is keywords. Now this is your key allegiance, whether you're going to be going towards the Imperium of Man or whether you're going to be going towards the Mechanicum. Then we're going to be covering households. Now households are subsets of each of those main questorous allegiances, and these kind of lead into various different bonuses within your army. Then we're going to be talking about the different classes of knights. Now there are actually 5 classes of knight in total. Some of which are not in the Codex, some of which are Forge World only. Forge World do produce a number of knights. If you've been following me on Instagram and Twitter, you'll know what I'm talking about. Then we're going to go through each of the abilities. Now this is what's granted within your household. Then we're going to talk about the formation of Knight Lances. Now this is basically how you're going to generate your command points for your army. Now this is very different within a Knight Codex, because as you'll notice as we go through these videos, every entry is a Lord of War. Next up, we'll then go through household traditions. This is basically how you go about making a detachment when you've only got Lords of War to pick from. Then we're going to go through Warlord Traits. As with pretty much any codex, every Warlord will have a trait. Then we'll talk heirlooms. Now this is the fancy word within the Knight Codex for basically all of the relics or the bonus gear that you can actually take or spend command points on your characters. Then what we'll do is we'll talk about free blades. Now free blades are basically knights that are still questorous aligned, i.e. Imperium of Man or Mechanicus, but they're no longer part of a household. They've gone a bit rogue, gone a bit solo, and there are some special rules just for those guys. Finally, we'll talk a little bit about army composition. Now you haven't got that many units to choose from, although it is quite a surprising number really when you think about it. We'll talk about how to do this towards a 2,000 point army. Because everything's a Lord of War, that means there are an awful lot of points or an awful lot of power level, so we're going to try and pitch this at 2,000 points. If you're playing a pure Imperial Knights army, that's kind of where you want to be aiming for realistically, to be able to at least play a number of models. Otherwise you're going to end up with a very small army and probably not do very well with it. There's a few publications that we're going to need to get started with our Imperial Knight forces. The first one is quite obvious, it is the Codex, and the second part of that is the FAQ. As I mentioned in the opening to this video, there's a number of things that have changed within the Imperial Knight Codex, and this is available online. The second part of this is Chapter Approved 2019 and its associated FAQ. Now both FAQs are available online from Warhammer Community's website, and the link is on the screen for you now. There's a couple of reasons for this. The main one really is that the Imperial Knight Codex came out after the Chapter Approved 2019 dropped, and therefore they were kind of suffering a little bit. Every other army got bonuses to their command point structure, specifically around brigades and battalions, and the Imperial Knight Codex didn't really have that benefit. They were struggling to generate any CPs in order to use all of their awesome stratagems. Second part of that, within the points changes as well, Imperial Knights were at an interesting point, let's put it that way, no pun intended. So that specifically around the Dominus class. Now there was a lot of people that were playtesting and running tournament lists around a Dominus class knight, and they were using that in a soup formation, and it was deemed that that was running a little bit too cheap. There's also a few points changes with the armigers, and we'll get onto those point changes in subsequent videos and further along in this one as well. So the first thing we need to worry about then is our faction keywords, and this is our Questor allegiance. Every datasheet within the Codex contains a bracketed entry for Questor allegiance, and we replace it with one of two alternative words. Now this is to determine whether you are aligned to the Imperium of Man or you are aligned to the Mechanicum. So what we're going to do is replace that keyword with either Questor Imperialis or Questor Mechanicus. Now when we start moving into households in a second, normally you'd actually do this the other way around. You're going to look at the household that you probably really want and then see whether that is Imperialis or Mechanicus aligned, but we'll cover that in the next section. The next variable faction keyword we have within our data slate is household, and this is in the little triangular brackets. So what this does, this is like your Space Marine chapter or your Necron dynasty or your clan culture. Within each household, you're going to get a bonus rule applicable to every knight that is aligned to that household or part of that household. Now, there are a number of known households that have been written around in the Codex and on the in the background and so on, but you can equally make up your own household and then try and pick one of the rules that is already known that you can then apply to your household. For example, all of my household belong to the Legio Astorum, which is a larger Titanicus or Titan Legion, and all my knights are allocated to them. But when I play the game, what I'm going to do is actually pick one of the known households and then use the rules from that. So if you're going to make your own one up, use one of the rules that is within the book. If you're playing amongst friends though, maybe you want to come up with your own ideas, but obviously you need to get some agreement to do that. Within the Questor Imperialis then, there are a number of households, the first one being Household Griffith. The bonus here being you get to add one to your attacks characteristics for the knights allocated to that household in any turn in which it charged or heroically intervened. The other bonus here is that any knight within this household can heroically intervene as if it was a character. Now we'll get on to how we define our characters a little bit later in the video. The second household is Household Hawkshroud. Models within this household double the number of wounds that they are counting for the purposes of the damage bracket within each of the knights. Now, being a Lord of War, every knight kind of degrades as it gets damaged, but we're counting double the number of wounds here to determine which profile we're going to be using. The next one up is House Cadmus. Being part of this household tradition allows you to reroll ones in the fight phase against units with a wounds characteristic of 12 or less. Basically, these guys are after the smaller, lesser models or enemy units, so they're not going to be going against all the big super stuff, but it allows you to get that reroll of 1 against stuff with a wounds characteristic less than 12, so a lot of smaller infantry rather than some of the bigger vehicles and so on. Finally, under Questor Imperialis is House Mortan. This allows us to add 1 to any hit roll in any turn you were charged, did charge, or heroically intervene. This means that you're going to be hitting on a much better chance, and therefore this is going to be good for any close combat orientated knights. Within Questor Mechanicus then, we have a number of households here as well, the first one being House Raven. There's a double bonus here. Any models within this household tradition don't suffer any negative modifiers for advancing and firing their assault weapons. Now normally if you advance and fire an assault weapon, you -1 from your ballistic skill. These guys will ignore that. The extra bonus being here is that most knights, their weapons are all heavy weapons, so there's very few assault weapons to pick from. However, these guys, in the turns that they do advance, all of their heavy weapons count as assault weapons. So any heavy weapon now becomes an assault weapon, so you can always move, advance, and then fire without any negatives to your ballistic skill. Next up is House Tyrannus. Knights within this household get a 6+ shrug save, or a feel no pain save if you like, against any wounds caused to that knight unless they were caused by a mortal wound infliction. Next up is House Krast. House Krast is a bit of a combat specialist which allows you to re-roll all failed hit rolls in the turn that you charged, were charged, or performed a heroic intervention. Additionally, if that combat procrastinates a little bit longer and you are in combat with another Titanic unit, you can always re-roll your failed hits. Finally, we have House Volker. House Volker allows you to re-roll hit rolls of a 1 with your ranged weapons against targets that are the nearest to that knight. So that covers all of the households. Now, as I said, when we were picking our Questor allegiance, most people would traditionally pick which of those households best suits their playstyle, or if you're really trying to look down the competitive route, which is probably the most advantageous to your knight build, and then you'll align it to whichever one they belong to. So if I really like House Raven because of the mobility it offers my knights, rather than having to sit back and try and shoot and never advance, when you're trying to get onto objectives, you really want to be able to move and still shoot without being penalised. So I really like the House Raven style. It means that my knights are always moving without having to sort of stand around like lemons for a little bit. If you like the idea of getting into combat and doing all the rerolls in combat, you might prefer a different household, and you might prefer House Griffith, for example, and therefore you may align yourself to the Questor Imperialis. The next thing I want to talk about then are the different classes of knight that we can have. Now, within the Codex, there are 3 classes of knight: the Armiger, the Questoris, and the Dominus. Forgeworld have released a couple of different classes of knight. That's the Cerastus and the Acastus class knights. This gives us a total of 5 different classes of knight that we can pick and play, because there are rules for all of those to use in Warhammer 40k. If you want to use the rules for the Forgeworld units, they are freely available on the Forgeworld website. They've also introduced a number of different variants of Armiger as well. So within the Codex, we've got a couple of classes of Armiger, but Forgeworld have introduced some different weapon options that we can use in 40k, really opening up the knight options and the knight flavour. So not only have they given us alternative Armiger classes to play around with, there's 4 classes of Cerastus, or 4 variants of Cerastus, and 2 classes of Acastus class as well. Now, you start getting into some larger funding if you really want to go down that route. Those options are not specifically cheap. The Armigers aren't terrible, but a little bit more expensive than the plastic standard. You basically get a full Armiger build, but without the weapons, and then they replace those with different various resin upgrade pieces and the resin weapons. Now, on screen for you now is a full selection of those 5 different classes of knights. You can see them from the smallest to the largest. So from left to right then, we have an Armiger class, followed by a Questoris class, then we have the Dominus class, then we have a Cerastus, which is one of the Forgeworld variants, and then finally the Acastus class, where we have a further 2 variants. I don't own both variants, unfortunately. Next I want to talk about abilities then. This gives us access to Knight Lances, Traditions and Free Blades. Knight Lances is where we're talking command points. This is how we build our armies, purely out of Imperial Knights, and trying to get some command points so we can spend those on our stratagems. There are only 2 detachments available because every option is a Lord of War. That is the Super Heavy Auxiliary Detachment, where we are allowed to pick 1 Lord of War choice, and then a Super Heavy Detachment, where we have to have at least 3 Lords of War within that detachment. If you run any knights within an Auxiliary Super Heavy Detachment, you get 0 command points. If you run at least 1 Questoris class or above knight in a Super Heavy Detachment, you will gain 3 command points. And if you run 3 or more Questoris or larger knights within your Super Heavy Detachment, you will gain 6 command points. This is a big change over the original Codex, which was only going to give us 3 command points and not 6. And that's made a huge change and opened up a whole bunch of stratagems that were pretty much not available, because you're not going to get very many command points because you're only going to be running 2 at the most detachments within your Imperial Knights army. On top of that, of course, if your army is Battleforged, which it will be because you're taking it from the single Codex, then you're going to get your 3 command points for being Battleforged in the first place. Next, let's talk Household Traditions. Now, I've already gone through all of the different types of household that you can belong to, but every knight within the same detachment, so each Super Heavy Detachment, needs to be from the same household. That doesn't stop you, of course, running 2 different households and still being Battleforged. So you could run a House Griffith, Imperialis aligned, and a House Raven detachment as well, and still be Battleforged. And it allows you to paint knights in a different colour scheme if you really want to go that way. One of the good things about collecting knights is the variance in the painting. You can really go to town with Household Traditions, with those armour panels, with all the decals that are available. It is a bit of a modeller's and painter's dream. Finally, a quick word on Free Blades while we're in this section then. Free Blades are still aligned to the Questor Imperialis or Mechanicus, but they are no longer household aligned, and we'll get onto those a little bit later in this video. Within each super heavy detachment, you can allocate one of those knights to be your character, and from one of those characters, one of them can be your warlord. Once you do that, that opens up you some warlord traits. Now, every codex in the game has a warlord and a warlord set of traits, and you can actually, there's ways to generate additional warlord traits as well with various stratagems. So we've got 6 options for our warlord traits, and also some bonus ones if you are going to be running one of the known households as well. So household Griffith, for example, and Raven, they have an additional type of warlord trait if you don't want to pick from the main list of 6. The first warlord trait is Cunning Commander. This gives you basically a free reroll during the game, once per battle. That could be a hit roll, saving throw, anything like that as well. In addition, choosing this particular warlord ability gives you an additional command point. The second one is Iron Bulwark. This basically moves your invulnerable save. Every knight has an invulnerable save at ranged weapons to a 4+. The third one is Knight Seneschal, and this adds 1 to your attacks characteristic for your warlord. The fourth one is Landstrider. This allows you to add 2 inches to your advance and charge rolls for all units that are in that household within 6 inches of your warlord. Number 5 is Blessed by the Sacristans. This allows you to pick one of the weapons on your warlord, and every unmodified roll of a 6 to wound causes a mortal wound in addition to the damage it's already done. So this could be a close combat weapon or a ranged weapon, but what it cannot be is one of the heirlooms. Finally, number 6 then is Fearsome Reputation. Every enemy unit within 12 inches of your warlord must -1 from their leadership. If they're within 6 inches of your warlord, it's -2. Now, as I said, if you haven't picked any one of those, but you are running one of the known households, you can pick one of their warlord traits as well. Now, if you haven't picked one of those 6, and you are running a household that is known, you can also use, as a replacement to that list, one of their warlord traits. House Terran, for example, has Champion of the Household. You can re-roll failed charge rolls for your warlord. House Griffith has Master of the Joust. Immediately after your warlord completes a charge move, choose one enemy unit within 1 inch and roll a d6. On a 4+, that unit suffers a d3 mortal wounds. House Hawkshroud, Duty of the Forsworn. At the start of the first battle round, but before the first turn begins, select one unit in your opponent's army, add 1 to hit rolls made for your warlord against that unit. House Cadmus, Veterans of Griffin 4. Reduce all damage suffered by your warlord in the fight phase by 1 to a minimum of 1. House Mortan, Legacy of the Black Pool. Subtract 1 from all hit rolls for attacks that target your warlord at a range greater than 18 inches. I really like that one. House Raven, Master of the Trial. Add 1 to saving throws made for your warlord against attacks that have an AP characteristic of -1. This does not affect invulnerable saving throws. So against a lot of bolt weapons, for example, especially unless they're in tactical doctrine when they become -2, but certainly for the first round, AP -1 bolt guns that are going to be targeting this guy, you're going to end up with a 2+ save. House Tyrannus, Knight of Mars. Each time you make a wound roll of 6+ for your warlord in the shooting phase, the AP characteristic of that attack is improved by 1, i.e. AP 0 becomes AP -1. House Krast, First Knight. Reroll hit rolls of 1 for your warlord. And House Volker, Adamantium Knight. Wound rolls of 1, 2 or 3 made for attacks against your warlord always fail, even if the attack has a strength characteristic higher than your warlord's toughness characteristic. That's like transhuman physiology for the Space Marines. That's pretty cool. Next up, we talk heirlooms. Now, these are basically relics and abilities and so on that you can put onto your warlord or character that allows you to sort of upgrade and play around with different weapon options. Now, there are 4 pages of this. I'm not going to go through every one. But as an example, one of them that is quite popular is the Paragon Gauntlet. Now, what this does is replaces the Thunderstrike Gauntlet, which is available on one type of class of knights, with a different profile. The profile is not hugely different, but it is quite good fun. So the Paragon Gauntlet, for example, is a ranged melee, because it's a power fist, strength of ×2, an AP -4, and a damage of flat 8. Now, if a vehicle or a monster is slain by that weapon, you can pick an enemy unit within 9 inches of the bearer, roll a d6 on a 4+. That unit suffers d3 mortal wounds because you're basically picking up the wreck, throwing it across the battlefield at that other unit. So what's the difference between that particular heirloom and the standard Thunderstrike Gauntlet? This is a flat damage of 8. The Thunderstrike Gauntlet is flat damage 6. So you're gaining 2 points of damage using this. So that's one of the heirlooms as an example. And there are a number of heirlooms that are specific to households as well. So, for example, the Hunter's Eye heirloom is for House Cadmus models only. Enemy units do not receive the bonus to their saving throws for cover against the bearer's ranged attacks. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that are within this that you can pick throughout your knight armies. Now finally, I want to talk about free blades. So as I mentioned earlier in this video, free blades are basically, they're still Questor Mechanicus or Questor Imperialis aligned, but they're no longer part of a household. And as such, we still need to be able to give them maybe some kind of benefit, but if you're going to give them a benefit, because they're not part of a household and they don't have all of that support network that comes with being part of a larger organisation, there's going to be some downsides too. In the Codex, we call this qualities and burdens. Now, you're allowed to pick a quality, and you're allowed to pick the negative modifier that goes with this, or the burden that goes with it. However, if you pick a quality, you only pick one, or you can randomly determine two by rolling 2d6. So realistically, what that's doing is you can really focus in and pick one particular quality that you really like, or you can gamble, roll 2 dice and get 2. Conversely though, when you're talking burdens, if you want to pick, you have to pick 2. If you want to gamble, you only have to roll 1 dice. It's the complete opposite to the qualities. So if you pick a quality, you get 1. If you pick a burden, you've got to pick 2 burdens. Or if you want to play the dice and roll the dice, you could gain 2 qualities and only 1 burden. Now there are 6 qualities and there are 6 burdens. The first quality is last of their line. Reroll hit rolls of 1 for the free blades attacks against units containing 10 or more models. Second one is sworn to a quest. Reroll hit rolls of 1 for this free blade when it targets the enemy warlord. If this free blade is within range of an objective marker, it controls that objective marker even if there are more enemy models within range of the same marker. If an enemy unit within range of the same objective marker has a similar ability, then the objective marker is controlled by the player who has the most models. So it's objective secured for your knight. The third one is Mysterious Guardian. This free blade can perform heroic interventions as if it were a character. If you do so, any enemy units that are within 6 inches at the end of the enemy charge phase and can move up to 6 when doing so. The fourth one is Peerless Warrior. When this quality is chosen or generated, roll a d6. On a 1 to 3, add 2 inches to the free blade's move characteristic. On a 4 to 5, improve its weapon skill characteristic by 1. And on a 6, improve its ballistic skill by 1. Random. Number 5 is Indomitable. Add 1 to the free blade's wounds and leadership characteristic. And number 6 is Legendary Hero. Once per battle round, you can re-roll a single hit, wound or damage or charge or saving throw for that warblade. So basically a free re-roll at any point without having to use a stratagem. However, we've also got burdens. Exiled in Shame is the first one. Whilst this burden applies, the free blade cannot be affected by any stratagems. This includes using a command reroll for that free blade. So yeah, you can't use any abilities. That's quite a burden. The second one is Weary Machine Spirit. Whilst this burden applies, halve the number of wounds on the free blade for the purposes of determining which characteristic to use. Now that's pretty nasty. Haunted by Failure is the third one. Whilst the burden applies, reroll hit rolls of 6 for the free blade. So you've got some 6s, which is always nice, but you're going to have to reroll those. Obsessed with Vengeance for number 4. Whilst the burden applies, the free blade can only target the nearest enemy unit that is visible to it in the shooting phase and can only declare a charge against the nearest enemy unit. Okay. Number 5 is Driven to Slaughter. Whilst this burden applies, the free blade cannot fall back and its ballistic skill characteristics is changed to 6. Okay. And Impetuous Nature. Whilst this burden applies, every move that the free blade makes must take it closer to the nearest enemy model. And unless it is already within 1 inch of an enemy unit, it must declare a charge at every enemy unit within 12 inches in your charge phase. Crazy stuff. That's every enemy unit. However, these burdens are not always going to be in play. So at the start of your turn, roll 2d6, subtracting 1 if the result of the free blade has Exiled in Shame. If the result is less than the free blade's leadership, now most knights are leadership 9, the burdens don't apply. So if you roll under your leadership, you're going to be fine. If you equal or exceed your leadership though, so if you roll a 9+, you're going to be burdened. Good thematic fun, but a bit of a gamble, right? So, but if you want to run free blades, I think they're quite thematic, quite cool. But I really like the negative sides to it, right? So these people are not part of that household. They're gonna get some okay-ish benefits, okay qualities, but the burdens can be quite nasty. So to wrap this video up then, I'm just going to go through a couple of example knight builds. The first one here on screen then is a pure Games Workshop, no Forge World, available from your local Games Workshop or independent stockist. It's formed of 2 super heavy detachments. The first one contains 3 Questorous Knights. The first one being a Knight Errant, so he has a heavy stubber, a Reaper chainsword and a thermal cannon. The second one is a Knight Paladin, a heavy stubber, a rapid fire battle cannon with a heavy stubber built in, and a Reaper chainsword. And then finally a Knight Warden with an Avenger Gatling cannon with heavy flamer, and a heavy stubber, and then a Thunderstrike gauntlet. The second super heavy detachment has 2 armigers, 1 Helverin and 1 Warglaive, and then another Knight Errant, so a thermal cannon and Reaper chainsword guy. I've also given him a twin Icarus autocannon turret weapon, and both armigers have upgraded their heavy stubbers to melter guns. This comes in at 1,964 points. One of the big challenges about building a knight list is those spare points, because there's not very many upgrades. We've got 3 different carapace weapon upgrades for the larger knights and 2 weapon upgrades for the smaller armigers, which means trying to fill those last remaining points without going over your points budget is quite difficult. So that's why this is quite short of 2,000 points, with still a number of points still to play with. There are some other upgrades I could give to those other 3 knights. I don't have those weapons painted, but that's how you would try and push towards the 2,000 points. This army comes with a number of command points associated to it. So it's 3 for being battle forged, and then the super heavy detachment with 3 Questorous Knights gives me 6 command points, and the one with 1 Questorous Knight and 2 armigers gives me 3 command points. That's a total of 12 command points for this army. We can give that 1 extra command point if we choose a particular Warlord trait, but that's going to come down to personal preference and how many command points you think you're going to be using during a game. As you can see, 2,000 points doesn't get you very many models. The second example I've got for you here, guys, is to try and squeeze in a Dominus class knight. So this is larger than a Questorous, cost an awful lot more points, and therefore you can see we've had to drop a couple of Questorous classes just down to 2 here, and then take an additional couple of armigers just to fill the points out. So the first super heavy detachment contains our Knight Valiant, which is the big guy on the top right hand side of the picture. He is with a single shield breaker cannon and 4 shield breaker missiles, as well as his conflagration cannon and Thunderstrike harpoon. With him then are a couple of armigers as well. In this case I've got 2 armiger Helverins. The second super heavy detachment has 2 Knights Errants and 2 armiger Warglaives. Now, trying to get a Paladin in or anything a little bit more expensive, the Knight Errant is actually a fairly cheap in comparison knight to the others. That's the one with the thermal cannons. So that's what we've got here. This list comes in at 1,977. We could add a couple, or at least 1 carapace weapon to get us nearer that 2,000 points. I don't have those modelled on this example. But this is a good example of getting in one of those Dominus classes. Now, if we were to push into Forge World, what we can do is replace that Dominus class Valiant that we've got there with something like one of the Cerastus classes, because they're pretty expensive points wise, and that's kind of where you're going to be leaning towards. So there we go then, guys. That is a run through of the Imperial Knight Codex with all of the different variations that we need in order to build a pure Imperial Knight list. Now, is the big question, are Imperial Knights competitive? I'm sure that is still on many people's lips. I know, going back to sort of previous editions, 7th edition Knights were ridiculously tough. But in 8th edition, it's a very, very different game. Command points and strategy, scoring objectives, ITC style missions, line of sight being so key. Imperial Knights are probably, pure Imperial Knights certainly are not top tier. Many armies these days can easily take out at least 1 or 2 knights a turn. They've got a lot of stratagems to reduce the requirement to be able to wound you. And you just cannot kill enough of the enemy with such few units while still trying to maintain board control and score objectives. That's probably the biggest downside. Plus, they're so big, you can't really hide them. If you go second to an Iron Hands army or a Drakari fielding 22 Dark Lances, you're going to struggle because you'll probably lose half your army. If you go first, can you kill enough before the enemy then punch you back? That's probably the biggest challenge for me running pure Imperial Knights, which is why you will probably only really find the odd one in an allied soup kind of list where they're going to be spending all their stratagem and command points on the knight to beef him up and then use him as that big fire magnet or big shooty stick. Pure Imperial Knights, they're good fun, and the key to playing them is when you are playing it as a pick-up game rather than a tournament game, is to let your friends know that's what you're bringing. 2 things about playing a game is you should be playing with your friends and not against your friends. And if they're bringing a balanced and a friendly kind of list and they don't have enough anti-armour, then it's not going to be very much fun for those guys. However, if they bring too much and become a bit competitive about trying to purely take out your knights, it's not going to be fun for you either. So when you're going to play an Imperial Knight army, come to an agreement with your friends, because nobody wants a game that's over in turn 1 or turn 2. You want to play it out to the end of turn 4 and turn 5 so that it's still good fun. So yeah, pros and cons, but yeah, if you're going to play pure Imperial Knights, let your friends know, but equally don't let them tip the balance too much. You know, it's give and take when you're playing with and playing against people. Now that's going to wrap this particular video up on how we build our Imperial Knights army. Subsequent videos in this series are going to break down each of those 5 different classes, so the Armiger, the Questorus, the Dominus, the Cerastus and the Acastus classes. We're going to go through each of those, showcase some of my models because it's my channel, that's what I'm going to do, and show you those different types. We'll break them down, we'll do a little bit of a tactical analysis on each, and then maybe see if we can come up with some alternative or some other fun lists as we go through. But I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it useful if you're just starting out on your Imperial Knight ventures. They're great models. You don't need that many. Yes, you're paying a little bit more for them. Are they cheaper than running a Space Marine army? It's all swings and roundabouts. But I love them. I hope you do too. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. I shall catch you guys on the next video.